Picture this. The marble streets of Rome glisten under the late afternoon sun, the scent of incense drifting from nearby temples. Merchants shout from shaded stalls, the clink of coin against bronze scales marking each sale. Then the crowd falls into an uneasy hush. People shift, heads turn, whispers catch like fire in dry grass. Through the open space of the forum strides the emperor himself, Nero, robes heavy with gold thread, an entourage of guards and senators in tow. But it is not his presence alone that draws the murmurs. It is the figure walking beside him. She is young, draped in silks dyed in colors so rare they cost a fortune for a handful of cloth. Pearls, imported from the far corners of the empire, shimmer at her neck. Her face is delicate, almost ethereal, yet something in her features unsettles the onlookers. For behind her beauty lies a truth that few dare say aloud. This empress was once a boy named Sporus. What you're seeing is more than a scandal. It is a living monument to grief warped into obsession, and love twisted into possession. What Nero did to Sporus would be whispered about for centuries, not just for its cruelty, but for the way it revealed the darkest truth about absolute power. That in the wrong hands, a human being can be remade into a fantasy, stripped of identity, and forced to live as a ghost of someone else. Before we walk into the shadowed corridors of this story, consider this. This is not merely another tale of Roman decadence. It is a tragedy where politics, vanity, and grief are woven so tightly together that it becomes impossible to tell where love ends and madness begins. Sporus's name may not appear in your school books, but I promise you this. Once you hear his story, you will remember it. Because behind the marble busts and imperial titles, there was a boy who was remade against his will, and who, despite everything, found one final way to reclaim himself. But to understand Sporus's fate, we must first turn to the man at the center of this storm, Nero. Contrary to the caricature of a mad tyrant who fiddled while Rome burned, Nero was not born a monster. In fact, when he took the throne at just 16 years old, the city held its breath in anticipation. Here was youth, vigor, and charm wrapped in imperial purple. His early reign seemed almost like the dawn of a golden age. He lowered taxes, poured money into games and spectacles for the people, and even took to the stage himself, singing and performing in a way no emperor had dared before. To the masses, this was a ruler who wanted to be seen, to be loved. To the Senate, he was a gamble, but one that, at first, seemed to be paying off. And yet, anyone who has studied Rome's emperors knows how quickly promise can curdle. For Nero, the poison was subtle, the constant awareness that every man in his court might be plotting to replace him, the crushing solitude of being the only voice that could never be contradicted. Each decision he made was greeted with applause, whether wise or foolish, until praise became meaningless. Then came the wound that would never heal. Whether it was the isolation, the paranoia, or the tragedy we are about to witness, something inside Nero shifted. Over the years, his life became less about ruling Rome and more about creating a world that existed only to reflect his desires. And that world began to crystallize around one woman, a woman who would both captivate and destroy him. Poppaea Sabina. Poppaea did not enter Nero's life like a quiet breeze. She arrived like a summer storm. At the time, Nero was married to Octavia, the daughter of the previous emperor, Claudius. That union had been born not of love, but of politics. Octavia was gentle, reserved, and entirely suited to the role of an imperial wife on paper. But for a young emperor who thrived on spectacle, her quiet dignity soon felt like a shackle. Poppaea was her opposite in every way. Her beauty was the kind that silenced a room, yet she was more than a pretty face. She possessed wit, charm, and a sharp instinct for power. She knew exactly how to catch and hold Nero's attention. Where Octavia sought the safety of discretion, Poppaea courted the gaze of every onlooker, stepping into a room as if it were a stage crafted for her alone. Their affair began as many in Rome did: whispered meetings, lingering glances at public gatherings, the thinly veiled excuses to be in the same place at the same time. But what started as a courtly intrigue quickly grew into something much darker. Nero was not merely smitten, he was consumed. Ancient writers, never shy of moral judgment, recorded that Nero's fixation on Poppaea became so intense that it unsettled even his most loyal advisers. He began shadowing her movements, his temper flaring if another man dared to linger on her beauty for too long. Soon, guards were stationed at her side, ostensibly for her safety, but in truth to monitor her every word and gesture. The gifts he lavished upon her were beyond extravagant. Jewels from India, silks brought overland from China, exotic perfumes from the Arabian deserts, each shipment a declaration that the emperor's desire could reach the ends of the earth. But the true measure of his obsession was not in what he gave, but in what he took away. First, he divorced Octavia, a move that shocked Rome to its core. Octavia was beloved by the people, seen as a symbol of stability in a turbulent time. Nero's rejection of her did not merely anger the Senate, it alienated the citizens who had once cheered for his reign. Then, with breathtaking audacity, Nero announced his intention to marry Poppaea. The imperial wedding was a performance of unimaginable luxury: garlands of flowers imported from distant provinces, musicians flown in from Greece, and banquets that spilled into days of feasting. The city was drenched in the theater of imperial love. Yet, for Poppaea, this union was no simple fairy tale. She was intelligent enough to recognize the power she now held. As empress, she maneuvered carefully, building alliances, promoting her family's interests, and shaping the emperor's decisions from behind the curtain. She played the role of the devoted wife to perfection, but beneath the surface, she was consolidating her own security. Still, she remained unlike the rest of Nero's court. Where others bent like reeds before his moods, Poppaea would sometimes stand firm. She did not hesitate to challenge him, over politics, over his artistic pursuits, even over his personal behavior. It was a dangerous dance, one in which the smallest misstep could mean disaster. Rome watched them, fascinated and fearful, as the emperor and empress became locked in a private storm. This was not a love story. It was a battle of wills dressed in silk and gold, and the moment when the storm would break was fast approaching. By 62 A.D., the imperial palace had become both a stage and a cage. Nero reveled in the theater of power, and Poppaea knew exactly how to play her part. But while the marriage glittered in public, their private life was far more volatile. The same passion that bound them together often spilled over into fierce, unrestrained arguments. To the Romans, Poppaea was a vision. Her skin was said to glow with the sheen of daily milk baths. She traveled in litters lined with silver, attended by slaves whose only duty was to fan her with plumes of dyed ostrich feathers. She was an empress who embraced the performance of her role. Every public appearance a carefully composed tableau of elegance and power. Nero, intoxicated by her beauty, went to obsessive lengths to preserve it. Ancient accounts speak of him forbidding her to bathe in anything but distilled rainwater, commissioning ointments from Alexandria's most skilled perfumers, and bringing physicians to court solely to preserve her complexion. He surrounded her with artists to paint her likeness again and again. So many portraits that her image adorned every corner of the palace, as if Rome itself could forget her if her face were not constantly in view. But Poppaea was not merely an ornament to be displayed. She had grown up in an elite household, adept at reading the shifting tides of politics. She had been married before, to Otho, a close friend of Nero, and she knew firsthand the cost and the opportunities that came with proximity to power. When she entered Nero's life, she did so with her eyes open, aware that his favor could be as dangerous as it was rewarding. Still, it was her independence that made her different. In a court where most people existed to echo the emperor's thoughts, Poppaea dared to have her own. She could argue policy, question his public appearances, even laugh at his less-than-stellar stage performances, an act that would have terrified any other courtier. It was precisely this blend of deference and defiance that kept Nero both enchanted and infuriated. Yet, for all her intelligence, Poppaea could not have foreseen how volatile Nero's affection truly was. His devotion had crossed into possession. He no longer simply loved her, he needed her, like a talisman that held together his fragile sense of control. When she was absent, he filled his days with restless performances and lavish spending. When she was present, his world narrowed until it contained only her. The empire, vast and complex, began to fade from his attention. The Senate, foreign dignitaries, the demands of the provinces, all of it seemed to matter less than the whims of one woman. It was as if Nero had decided that Rome could wait, but Poppaea could not. And so the palace became both her fortress and her prison. Guards patrolled her chambers, loyal not to her, but to Nero's will. Visitors were screened, conversations monitored, letters intercepted. She was the most admired woman in Rome, yet few could speak to her freely. The dangerous truth was this: Poppaea's beauty and independence gave her power, but in Nero's world they also marked her for tragedy. And by 65 A.D., the fuse that had been burning quietly in the shadows was almost spent. By the spring of 65 A.D., the delicate balance between passion and power in Nero's marriage had begun to tilt dangerously. The emperor's fixation on Poppaea had shifted from indulgent admiration to a suffocating need to control every facet of her existence. What had once been courtly devotion now felt like the tightening grip of a man desperate to possess not only her love, but her very being. In public, their life together still gleamed with the veneer of imperial splendor. Lavish banquets were held where Poppaea presided at his side, her hair braided in the latest Alexandrian style, pearls woven into every twist. Musicians from Greece played at her command, and poets competed to immortalize her beauty in verse. The empire saw a couple united in grandeur. But behind the marble walls, Nero's insecurities were turning the palace into a place of watchfulness and fear. He began dictating where Poppaea could go, what company she could keep, and even how she should respond to others in conversation. If a senator's compliment lingered too long, if a glance from a visiting dignitary strayed beyond the bounds of etiquette, Nero's temper would flare. The man who had once brought her the treasures of the world now guarded her as though she were a jewel he feared might be stolen. Poppaea, for her part, navigated these moods with the skill of a seasoned courtier. She knew how to soothe his rages with a word, how to flatter his vanity, and when to let silence speak for her. Yet she never entirely abandoned her own voice. She still challenged him on policy matters, sometimes urging moderation where his impulses leaned toward extravagance or cruelty. And she was unafraid to critique his artistic endeavors, something no one else in Rome would dare to do. This independence, though perhaps part of what had first drawn Nero to her, also stoked his darker impulses. He was a man who saw contradiction not as healthy discourse, but as betrayal. The more she asserted herself, the more he tried to close his hands around her life. Rome, of course, noticed the tension. Whispers drifted through the markets and over the steps of the Senate. The empress was too bold, the emperor too possessive. In a city where politics was a spectator sport, their marriage had become both scandal and entertainment. And yet, for all her influence and charm, Poppaea was not immune to the dangers of loving a man who held absolute power. She was playing a dangerous game with someone who believed that, as emperor, his emotions were law. No one contradicted Nero without consequence. Not senators, not generals, and not even the woman he claimed to love above all else. The stage was set. Their private arguments grew sharper, more frequent, and more perilous, and soon, in a moment of uncontrolled fury, the passion that had once bound them together would turn to violence that would shatter them both forever. The argument that ended Poppaea's life began like so many others. Words thrown back and forth in the gilded chambers of the imperial palace. The exact cause is lost to history, tangled in the conflicting accounts of ancient chroniclers. Tacitus claimed she had reproached Nero for neglecting his duties, accusing him of caring more for his theatrical performances than for the governance of Rome. Suetonius whispered it was jealousy over his late return from the chariot races. Others believed it was simply the inevitable eruption of tensions that had been building for years. What all the sources agree on is this. Poppaea was pregnant at the time, carrying what would have been their second child. That fact alone magnified the fragility of the moment. In Rome, the birth of an heir was more than a personal joy. It was a political event with the power to secure dynasties. But in the palace that day, it was not politics that spoke. It was rage. Some say it happened in a single moment. Nero, furious and unable to contain himself, lashed out and struck her in the abdomen with a violent kick. Others tell of a longer, more sustained attack, blows delivered in a storm of anger, ending with her crumpled on the marble floor. The silence that followed must have been suffocating. When the red mist of rage lifted, Nero saw what he had done. The woman he had elevated above all others lay broken before him. Servants rushed forward, but no one dared move without his command. For a heartbeat, the most powerful man in the known world stood powerless, staring at the irreversible consequence of his own hand. The palace erupted into frantic motion. Physicians were summoned. Men of the highest skill offered fortunes if they could save her, threatened with death if they failed. But it was already too late. Poppaea slipped away within hours, the unborn child with her. What followed was not the grief of an ordinary man. It was the grief of an emperor who believed himself a god, confronted for the first time with something he could not undo. He refused to have her body cremated according to Roman custom, ordering instead that she be embalmed and entombed in a monument more splendid than any built for an empress before. He declared her divine, a goddess to be worshipped. He created a cult in her honor, with priests and rituals dedicated to keeping her memory alive. In the palace, her absence was denied entirely. Her name was spoken as if she still lived. her favorite seat left empty at banquets, her apartments left untouched. Courtiers were expected to play along, smiling as though the empress might walk in at any moment. Anyone who broke the illusion risked exile or death. This was grief transmuted into delusion, an emperor's refusal to accept the permanence of loss. And it was within this distorted reality, half shrine, half prison, that a young man named Sporus would soon be drawn, forever altering the course of his life. Sporus was no ordinary youth plucked from the streets of Rome. He had been born into slavery within the imperial household itself, a world of polished marble floors, echoing colonnades, and constant watchfulness. From his earliest days, he moved in the shadows of the palace, absorbing the rhythms of court life. Fortunate, at least by the grim standards of slavery, he had been freed while still a boy and groomed for service as a pure delicatus, an attendant educated in manners, literacy, and the skills needed to serve Rome's most powerful. In that rarefied sphere, freedom was a fragile illusion. Freedmen like Sporus owed everything to the emperor's generosity. A shift in imperial favor could raise them to dizzying heights, or cast them down into oblivion. They could wield influence on one day and face execution the next, all without legal recourse. For those who lived in the orbit of power, survival was an art form. Sporus's true misfortune lay not in what he had done, but in what he resembled. Multiple ancient sources, Tacitus, Dio Cassius, Suetonius, agree on the same haunting detail. Sporus bore an uncanny resemblance to Poppaea Sabina. His face echoed hers in delicate bone structure, the curve of the cheek, the luminous eyes. In a world that saw physical likeness as a reflection of the soul, such a resemblance could seem almost supernatural. It was in the months after Poppaea's death, when the palace still lived under the suffocating fiction of her continued presence, that Nero first noticed him. Imagine the emperor's state of mind, a man so consumed by grief and guilt that he refused to accept reality, surrounded by portraits and statues of the woman he had killed. Then, one day, he sees Sporus, and for a moment, perhaps, he believes the gods have given him a miracle. But miracles in Nero's Rome rarely came without cruelty. The emperor's obsession reawakened, now sharpened by the impossible desire to undo what he had destroyed. If he could not bring Poppaea back to life, he would create her anew. Sporus was no longer a young man in his own right. He had become a blank canvas on which Nero would paint the image of his lost empress. There was, of course, one obstacle. Sporus was male. But to Nero, who had declared himself a god and demanded the Senate ratify his every whim, gender was a detail to be corrected. What began as a flicker of recognition became a plan, cold, deliberate, and irreversible. This was not merely the act of a man dressing another in a woman's clothes. This would be a transformation imposed by force and by blade. Nero summoned his physicians and ordered them to prepare for a procedure that would change Sporus's life forever. The palace that had been his home was about to become the place where his identity, his very self, was dismantled. And so began one of the most chilling episodes in the history of imperial Rome. The decision was made, and in Nero's Rome, his word was law. There was no appeal, no plea for mercy that could alter the emperor's will. Sporus, still barely into his mid-teens, was summoned to the private chambers of the palace, rooms where the marble floors gleamed, the air heavy with incense, and the windows were shuttered against the noise of the city. What awaited him was not a conversation, but a command. Nero, speaking with the finality of a man accustomed to shaping reality itself, decreed that Sporus would undergo surgery to make him resemble Poppaea completely. The physicians, trained in the crude but practiced arts of Roman medicine, were to strip him of the most basic marker of his identity, his manhood. Ancient surgical procedures were brutal. There was no anesthesia as we know it, only herbal concoctions to dull pain and alcohol to cloud the senses. Iron knives and cauterizing tools, cleaned by fire but far from sterile, would be the instruments of transformation. The risk of death from blood loss or infection was immense. And yet, the greater danger for Sporus was survival, because to live through the ordeal meant awakening into a body remade by someone else's will. He would have been restrained, physically held down while the physicians worked, his cries echoing in corridors where servants had long since learned not to intervene. In those moments, he ceased to be a person in the eyes of Rome's most powerful man and became a project, an object to be molded into an image that existed only in Nero's grief-stricken mind. The aftermath was no less harrowing. Recovery would have taken weeks, perhaps months, under the watch of attendants ordered to ensure not just his physical healing, but the progress of his transformation. As the pain subsided, the conditioning began. Imperial seamstresses crafted gowns to drape over his altered body, cut to flatter curves that had been artificially imposed. Jewelers took pieces once worn by Poppaea and adjusted them to fit Sporus, fastening her past directly onto his present. Then came the tutors. They taught him how to walk with the measured grace expected of a Roman empress. Small, gliding steps that suggested modesty, though every movement was rehearsed. His gestures were corrected. Hands to be held softly, palms rarely shown, chin lowered at certain angles, eyes cast down in calculated deference. Cosmetics became a daily ritual. Kohl darkened his lashes to exaggerate the almond shape of his eyes. Rouge was brushed across his cheeks to mimic the flush of youth. Powders softened any lingering masculine edges in his face. Even his hair was transformed, cut, curled, and styled into intricate arrangements that took hours to achieve and were crowned with ornaments of gold and pearl. Perhaps most invasive of all were the voice lessons. Tutors worked to raise the pitch of his speech, to change his tone, and to alter his phrasing to match the courtly, ornamental manner of Roman aristocratic women. The aim was total immersion, not merely for public appearances, but to make the performance seamless even in private. Every step of this process was a slow erasure. The boy named Sporus was being overwritten by an imperial fantasy. He was no longer allowed to carry himself as he wished, to speak as he once had, to dress in a way that reflected his own identity. His reflection in the polished bronze mirrors became a stranger's face. Poppaea's face, resurrected in flesh not her own. For Nero, it was triumph, the dead empress reborn, the guilt of her loss papered over with silk and jewels. For Sporus, it was the start of a life where every breath, every glance, every word would belong not to himself, but to the role forced upon him. By the spring of 67 A.D., the transformation was complete, or at least complete enough to satisfy Nero's vision. What had begun as a chilling whim was now an elaborate production, and, like all things in the emperor's life, it demanded spectacle. The imperial court was abuzz with whispers. Nero intended to marry Sporus, not as a joke, not as some private indulgence, but as a full ceremonial wedding befitting an empress of Rome. Preparations began months in advance. The great halls of the palace were hung with garlands of flowers imported from Egypt, their fragrance mingling with the scent of burning myrrh. Tapestries depicting scenes from myth, Orpheus retrieving Eurydice, Pygmalion statue brought to life, were draped along the walls, their symbolism lost on no one. This was a union not of man and woman, but of grief and delusion, wrapped in the trappings of divinity. Sporus, now living under the name Sabina, in direct homage to Poppaea Sabina, was dressed for the occasion in garments woven from Tyrian purple, a dye so costly that a single ounce could purchase a slave. Gold thread traced patterns of vines and pomegranates along the hem, symbols of fertility that felt like a cruel joke. The jewels he wore had once belonged to Poppaea herself. Pearls the size of doves' eggs, a diadem set with emeralds rumored to have been a gift from an Eastern king. The ceremony followed the formalities of a Roman patrician wedding. Before assembled dignitaries, Nero took Sporus's hand, their fingers intertwined over a sacrificial lamb's fleece in the ancient dextrarum junctio gesture. Vows were exchanged, vows that, in Nero's mind, bound them not just as husband and wife, but as man and resurrected muse. They shared the panis phareus, the sacred spelt bread, sealing a union that mocked the traditions it borrowed from. Guests smiled and applauded, their expressions carefully schooled into joy. But beneath the surface, the room hummed with unease. The senators, the generals, the foreign envoys, all of them understood the dangerous theater they were part of. To fail to play along was to risk exile or worse. To show disapproval, even with the flicker of an eye, was to gamble with one's life. Musicians played triumphal hymns as wine flowed and roasted peacocks, their feathers intact, were carried to the banquet tables. Every detail screamed of imperial might and boundless wealth, but it was wealth spent on a fantasy. Those who knew the truth saw not an empress, but a boy whose identity had been surgically stolen, whose every movement was a rehearsed echo of a woman long dead. From that day forward, Sporus lived as the official consort of the emperor. He was granted his own household staff, a retinue of attendants, and apartments within the palace decorated in Poppaea's style. He traveled in a gilded litter, shielded from the sun by silken canopies, escorted by guards as though he truly were the empress reborn. But the luxury was a prison. Every public appearance was a performance. Every private moment was shadowed by Nero's delusion. The emperor called him by Poppaea's name, recounted memories of moments that had never happened, and expected Sporus to respond as if they had been shared. In the eyes of Rome, Sporus had ceased to be himself entirely. He was not a man, not even a freedman. He was a mirror, reflecting back to Nero the image he could not bear to lose. By the spring of 67 A.D., the transformation was complete, or at least complete enough to satisfy Nero's vision. What had begun as a chilling whim was now an elaborate production, and, like all things in the emperor's life, it demanded spectacle. The imperial court was abuzz with whispers. Nero intended to marry Sporus. Not as a joke, not as some private indulgence, but as a full ceremonial wedding befitting an empress of Rome. Preparations began months in advance. The great halls of the palace were hung with garlands of flowers imported from Egypt, their fragrance mingling with the scent of burning myrrh. Tapestries depicting scenes from myth, Orpheus retrieving Eurydice, Pygmalion statue brought to life, were draped along the walls, their symbolism lost on no one. This was a union not of man and woman, but of grief and delusion, wrapped in the trappings of divinity. Sporus, now living under the name Sabina, in direct homage to Poppaea Sabina, was dressed for the occasion in garments woven from Tyrian purple, a dye so costly that a single ounce could purchase a slave. Gold thread traced patterns of vines and pomegranates along the hem, symbols of fertility that felt like a cruel joke. The jewels he wore had once belonged to Poppaea herself. Pearls the size of doves' eggs, a diadem set with emeralds rumored to have been a gift from an Eastern king. The ceremony followed the formalities of a Roman patrician wedding. Before assembled dignitaries, Nero took Sporus's hand, their fingers intertwined over a sacrificial lamb's fleece in the ancient dextrarum iunctio gesture. Vows were exchanged, vows that, in Nero's mind, bound them not just as husband and wife, but as man and resurrected muse. They shared the panis phareus, the sacred spelt bread, sealing a union that mocked the traditions it borrowed from. Guests smiled and applauded, their expressions carefully schooled into joy. But beneath the surface, the room hummed with unease. The senators, the generals, the foreign envoys, all of them understood the dangerous theater they were part of. To fail to play along was to risk exile or worse. To show disapproval, even with the flicker of an eye, was to gamble with one's life. Musicians played triumphal hymns as wine flowed and roasted peacocks, their feathers intact, were carried to the banquet tables. Every detail screamed of imperial might and boundless wealth, but it was wealth spent on a fantasy. Those who knew the truth saw not an empress, but a boy whose identity had been surgically stolen, whose every movement was a rehearsed echo of a woman long dead. From that day forward, Sporus lived as the official consort of the emperor. He was granted his own household staff, a retinue of attendants, and apartments within the palace decorated in Poppaea's style. He traveled in a gilded litter, shielded from the sun by silken canopies, escorted by guards as though he truly were the empress reborn. But the luxury was a prison. Every public appearance was a performance. Every private moment was shadowed by Nero's delusion. The emperor called him by Poppaea's name, recounted memories of moments that had never happened, and expected Sporus to respond as if they had been shared. In the eyes of Rome, Sporus had ceased to be himself entirely. He was not a man, not even a freedman. He was a mirror, reflecting back to Nero the image he could not bear to lose. In the early dawn of June 9th, 68 A.D., the world that Nero had built, of gold-threaded illusions and theatrical power, finally collapsed. News arrived that the Senate had declared him an enemy of the state. His guards deserted him, his friends scattered. For all his posturing as a god among men, Nero now found himself surrounded only by fear and silence. Sporus was still there, the sole constant from those twisted final years, drawn along not by loyalty, but by the inescapable force of the emperor's will. When soldiers closed in, Nero chose death over the humiliation of capture. Even his final act was theatrical, requiring the assistance of a freedman to guide the fatal blade. His body was hurriedly buried, leaving Sporus suddenly unmoored. For the first time since his forced transformation, the one man who had dictated his existence was gone. But freedom did not follow, because in the dangerous vacuum of Roman politics, Sporus was too valuable to be left alone. Almost immediately, he was claimed by Nymphidius Sabinus, the ambitious Praetorian prefect who had helped orchestrate Nero's downfall. Sabinus treated him much as Nero had, parading him through the palace, calling him Poppaea, and basking in the reflected glow of a beauty that was never truly his. When Sabinus himself fell from power, Sporus was passed to Otho, the very man who had once been Poppaea's husband before Nero took her. If Sporus hoped that Otho might release him from the charade, he was mistaken. Otho, perhaps out of lingering attachment or perhaps as a macabre indulgence, continued the same treatment, keeping Sporus in the role Nero had imposed. But Otho's reign was brief, and when Vitellius seized power, Sporus's situation grew far more perilous. Vitellius was a man without Nero's veneer of romance or Otho's sentiment. For him, Sporus was an object, an imperial curiosity to be used for entertainment. Ancient sources tell us that Vitellius planned to feature him in a public spectacle in the Colosseum, a grotesque reenactment of the myth of Proserpina, in which Sporus would be violated before a crowd, playing the part of the maiden abducted to the underworld. For Sporus, this was the final breaking point. He had endured years of enforced identity, of living as a ghost, of playing the empress in a game he never agreed to join. But public sexual humiliation before thousands was something he could not and would not survive. With the performance looming, he took the only choice left entirely in his own control. He ended his life, most likely with poison. He was no more than 20 years old. And so, in death, Sporus reclaimed the smallest fragment of agency that Rome had denied him. His story slipped into the margins of history, preserved by the pens of ancient historians more interested in the scandal than in the boy himself. Yet, if we look closely, beyond the gossip of court life and the decadence of imperial Rome, we see a tale that is almost unbearably human, of identity stolen, of survival under unbearable pressure, and of one final act of refusal. Sporus's life remains a grim testament to the dangers of unchecked power. His fate was shaped not by his own choices, but by the obsessions of men who saw him as a symbol, a possession, a plaything. And yet, in the end, it was his own hand that decided his final moment. Across the gulf of 2,000 years his silence still speaks, a reminder that even in the most gilded prisons, the human spirit will seek a way out.